Yes, Miss Scott.
Before the break, I said I was going to ask you about the example of when you were asked to advise the Macfarlane Trust on welfare policy, and the time has arrived and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it, or start off by doing it without reference to the document that shows the actual policy itself, partly because the document's not terribly clear in working out what the policy is. But if you do need to see the document, then do let me know. So in December 2008, you wrote a letter to to Martin Harvey at the Macfarlane Trust because he'd asked you to advise on a proposed welfare policy, and that letter is at WITN 3487008. And do you recall this?
Yeah, I remember writing it.
And so what seems to have happened is that a proposed welfare policy seems to have been sent to you, and you've been asked to provide your comments on it. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you set out your thoughts. You say, I think the proposed policy is very complicated, is inevitable when one drafts a means test onto another means test, which is effectively what's happening here. Were you there referring to the means test from the benefits system and then the Macfarlane Trust drafting their own means test onto the top of it?
I think this is revealing my problems typing. Drafts, clearly I think what I meant was grafts, a means test onto another means test. And yes, as a general principle, it's not a very good idea to have a separate means test for people who've already been means tested, often to death, by the DWP.
And so what the Macfarlane Trust seem to have been suggesting is that there should be a means tested support for registrants. Is that how you recall the policy?
Yeah. I mean, I've no longer got the policy, and I can't really remember the detail of it. I'm sorry, it's a long time ago. But as you see, I also was concerned that it didn't take into account the costs of children and the costs of taking paid employment. And there's a substantial. I mean, one of the things that should happen with any kind of means test, because it does inhibit people taking up paid work, is try to mitigate that as far as you can. And one way is sort of the costs of employment, travel, equipment, that kind of thing.
And you say there, this can... Oh, sorry, I interrupted you, sorry.
I was going to say, there's obviously they were proposing sort of step payments. And the problem with step payments is that it creates a cliff edge effect for people, and we get this elsewhere. We actually get this in places in the social security system. It's sort of a bit of an all or nothing, and it creates terrible problems for folk. And then I think, if I remember correctly, I was proposing a sort of tapered process.
Yes.
A bit similar to how you would have, say, in tax credits or housing benefit.
Yes, if we go over the page, you suggest an allowance could be made to include rent, council tax benefit not covered by housing and council tax benefit, and also mortgage interest payments, and then any remaining excess income after the above deductions would then be multiplied by 36%, and the sum deducted from the maximum payment. This is known as a tapering calculation, mirrors that used for tax credits. And
I'm just trying to think. I think the 36%, there may have been some research evidence at the time. When was this? 2008. Yeah, from the what was it? The Centre for Social Justice, who came up with the original proposal for universal credit, although it wasn't called that at the time. And I think that was the taper that they had worked out through research and number crunching to be the sort of optimum one for a means testing means tested benefit. But I may be wrong on that, but that kind of is what I can roughly recall.
And the inquiry is aware, because it's got the documentation and has heard evidence from witnesses over the last few weeks, that the McFarlane Trust did in fact put in a banded means test welfare policy. Do you recall whether the concerns and that you were expressing in this letter, it creates poverty traps and, as you say, a cliff edge? Did you see that the result? Did you see that in with your clients as a result of that policy? Can you recall?
No, because
you can take that down.
My focus was on people's social security benefit entitlement, not on the payments. I used to get, from time to time, I'd get grumbles from folk about McFarlane payments. And to be honest, I was never really able to distinguish whether they were referring to a discretionary payment or one of the sort of regular payments that came in later.
So your answer to my question was no, you didn't see those things. But is the reason? But the reason for that was you simply weren't looking for that. That's not your concern. You were concerned with their benefits.
No, that's not true. It's I have a lot of experience of negotiating with organisations, local authorities, the DWP. I've negotiated, I think, with 4 secretaries of state and probably about 9 junior ministers over the years. And, we make these points continually about the way things could be better. And you just accept that, well, I've made the point, I've made the case, win some, lose some. And, I just accepted that, they didn't accept my view. That's their prerogative.
I'm now going to ask you about the work you did with the McFarlane Trust around the introduction of the ESA. Can we have, please, Shomik, MACF 5090_006. So the events I'm talking about here took place in the summer of 2008, and I'm showing you here an email dated the 7th of August 2008 from you to Martin Harvey. And it says, Martin, a few thoughts. On a political level, I think it's very important for organisations to be lobbying now to point out the various shortcomings about ESA. You say the DWP government is locked in a fixed view that loads of people on IB could work if only their oversympathetic GPs would stop signing them off. And then make some other comments about the labour market and so on. And then skipping down to the, not missing out the next paragraph, down to many of us are also very concerned at the dreadful level of service already provided by the DWP to customers, and how their staff already often display a remarkable lack of understanding and even sympathy towards people with long-term health problems, and not at all confident at DWP's ability to manage the new system in a realistic and empathetic way. And I'm going to come on to ask you some further questions in relation to that. And then I think there's a historical political dimension for government. The problems associated with contaminated blood products resulted in a commitment by successive governments to compensate those affected by various means, including passporting those with AIDS-related conditions through the current IB assessment. This government has broken that consensus, and many people will view that as a breach of trust. I don't think concurrent DWP ministers have been adequately briefed about the history of the McFarlane Trust and the scale of the damage caused ultimately by government-funded use of contaminated blood. The government is very quick to respond when it's perceived as being harsh on the poor and vulnerable, and may respond to some high-profile lobbying and publicity on this. So just pausing there, how would you form the impression that current DWP ministers were not adequately briefed about the McFarlane Trust?
Well, sorry, what's the date? 2008. I mean, at the time I was involved, I was a member of the DWP's Policy and Strategy Forum. That's a consultative body that they used to have with the advice sector, and I was there as the representative of the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors. And we had, I say consultation, it usually consisted of them telling us stuff that they were going to do. We had presentations repeatedly from DWP officials, basically saying this is how it's going to be. This is what's going to happen. I had no indication that there was any understanding amongst DWP ministers that they were aware of the impact on the community. I can remember raising it at these consultative meetings, because obviously the minutes of the meeting actually do get passed up to ministers. I know that, it was a very, very difficult time because the then Labour government was pushing through ESA, which would have quite clearly had did have a very detrimental effect on the infected blood community. And we were trying to work out ways to get the DWP to mitigate that in some way. I have to say that DWP are a very difficult organisation to work with and to lobby. Very difficult. They're very introspective, and it's arrogant sometimes. There are some very fine civil servants working for them, very nice people, but it's very difficult to influence them. And it's very difficult to get at the minister. There are layers and layers of civil servants to have to work your way through. The communications civil servants will always, their office is right next. I know this because I work within DWP in a quite senior position on secondment. The communications officials had their office right next to the ministers, the advising, no, we don't think you should meet with this group because they might be critical of the department or of your policy, so on. Or yes, you should meet with these people, they could be helpful. So it's very, very, I think I think that email is probably a little bit of a kind of bit of a sort of, what's the word, stream of consciousness, attempting to try to get something done. As I recall, the outcome of it was that we actually had a meeting with the then Chief Medical Officer of the DWP, who was responsible for ESA policy or for the medical side of it, together with Deputy Dr. James Bolton, who I maintained contact with over the years. I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer. That I'm sorry about that.
When you suggested high-profile lobbying, you've said that it's difficult to lobby the DWP, but what did you have in mind?
I didn't have anything specific in mind, and the other thing I would say is that all governments can become highly defensive about criticism. I'll never forget, in 1998, the DWP implemented something called BIP, the Benefit Integrity Programme, which was a program of spot checks on people getting disability living allowance, and it was having catastrophic consequences for people. Their benefits being suspended and all sorts of things. And some disability activists went and held a protest outside the gates to 10 Downing Street and scattered red paint all over the ground and over themselves. And they were obviously arrested and so on. But I know that as a result of that, as I was told when I was at DWP, and I'm not breaking any rules because I never signed the Official Secrets Act, I was told that the Secretary of State had given instructions that because of that, there were to be no meetings with the disability lobby, as they called it, and or no ministerial meetings, and that officials needed to be ultra careful And I can think of several instances like that when I was there. It was a real insight into how they operate, of not wanting to have lobby groups given an opportunity. I mean, I'll give you another example. There was a leaflet which I was largely responsible for writing when I was at DWP, which was for pensioners and was about entitlement to the income support that they could then get and the higher rates they could get, and it's to encourage take benefit by older people, poorer older people. And there was to be a launch of it, and I wrote this memo suggesting it would be good to have some advice agencies there. Anyway, this memo found its way up to the Secretary of State. And I'll never forget, the communications officials emailed the Secretary of State and said, we don't think this is a good idea because they might use it as an opportunity to criticise the department. So anyway, and this was particularly age concern they were referring to, and which was actually very unfair in its own terms. So the launch went ahead with no advisors, no advice agencies there. That's what you're dealing with. It's very, very difficult, and I wasn't really clear how we could do it. But what we ended up doing, and I had several conversations with Martin over the phone about what we were going to do, because clearly ESA was going to have a really, really bad effect on people. And sadly, I've been proved right.
What you're suggesting here is that, in fact, the government is quick to respond when it's perceived to be harsh on the poor and the vulnerable, and that there is a role for the Macfarlane Trust to lobby and make the case to the DWP, who seem at that stage to be unaware of the impact that their policies are going to have. Mm-hmm. So, at least to that extent, whether one calls that high-profile lobbying or providing information, you clearly thought that there was a role for the Macfarlane Trust. Is that correct?
Yeah, but it would have to be something like going to the press, and with a real, shock story. And in my time, I have done that on several occasions where I've discovered things that the DWP was proposing, and I've taken it to the press. And really stuck my neck out for people. Because it's the right thing to do, and the press has run a story. It's been picked up by, other media, and the government has quietly backed down. But I have to say, it's always been on the fringes, on the margins. You had a government that was pressing ahead with implementing ESA. They wanted to reduce the numbers by 30%. I have an email from the DWP's former chief economist stating that, and I challenged him about it at the meeting, and he emailed me afterwards explaining the rationale. There was enormous pressure on government. I'm just looking at it objectively. There was enormous pressure on government from particularly the sort of tabloid press, who kept going on about, these people were swinging the lead, all these people on incapacity benefit, they could get jobs, and, then they'd highlighted some fraud case as someone who had been, working while they were claiming, that proves it, you need to crack down on these people. There was all that kind of noise going on, and indeed it continued for quite a few years afterwards under the coalition government.
And then moving down the email, sorry, Shamit, can we have that back up? It's MACF 5090_006. The next paragraph, you say, I also think that registrants would welcome lobbying by MFT on this. The ones I've dealt with have all had bad experiences with DWP, and I think it's important for MFT to be seen to be protecting their interests. Did that comment, was that a general comment made, or did that come because you sensed that actually the registrants were unhappy, or there was some disquiet about the way that Macfarlane Trust were fighting their corner with government?
No, it's just about, we've got to challenge this. It's in the interests of our community, of our registrants. I know that they would welcome us doing something, or McFarlane doing something, and I thought it would demonstrate to registrants that they were not alone, that McFarlane was, standing up for their rights and trying to protect their interests in the face of, a tsunami of benefit change.
And then in the next paragraph you say, so in a nutshell, I don't think there'll be any change from lobbying for social treatment for registrants within the policy terms of ESA and the statistically biased view that work is the best cure for illness, but one might be able to embarrass the government into some minor changes. It will also improve the MFT's good standing with registrants. Now, we'll come on to look at the meeting that arose out of after this email, but are you aware of any actions taken by the McFarlane Trust that would amount to embarrassing the government, trying to put some political pressure on them to get the government to back down because they'd be seen as harsh on the poor and the vulnerable?
I'm aware that they certainly raised it with Department of Health officials. Obviously, there would be a read across from quite senior level within the Department of Health as well to the DWP. I know from past experience, not dealing with this community, that can be effective in around the margins, and because government tends to make its decisions in a very silo-based approach to decision making and policy making. So you can, if you get someone to cut across that, it can sometimes be effective, but usually it's on the same minor changes. I have some vague recollection of it being raised politically, but I can't be specific. And I know Jan Barlow also did raise it with the Department of Health. I spoke to her about that.
Some years later, would that be?
Yeah, because it's just a horrible era of endless cases. It felt like of people having their benefits stopped, being told they were fit for work, people being assessed for ESA, reassessed in the middle of treatment. Horrible, really awful actually when I look back.
So
it makes me want to weep.
So then we come to the meeting in September 2008 that you've mentioned on a few occasions. It's MACF 40127_057. So this is a minute of a meeting between the MFT and the DWP. Is this the meeting that you're referring to? 11th of September.
Yes, this is with Moria Henderson, yeah.
And the purpose of the meeting set out there to discuss the soon-to-be implemented employment and support allowance, which will be replacing incapacity benefit and income support paid on incapacity grounds for new customers from 27th of October 2008, and more specifically how it will affect McFarlane's beneficiaries in the future. It was also intended to raise awareness of this cohort amongst DWP staff, so that they recognise they are recognised when being reviewed for ESA. So one of the issues that you identified in that previous email, that the DWP is under-briefed on the McFarlane Trust, this meeting was there to address that in part, was it?
Yes, and I mean, bearing in mind you're talking to very, very senior civil servants, both of those two. It wasn't a tense meeting, unlike many I've been at with the DWP, and it was a very good opportunity to try to get the case across. And I thought actually Martin did make the case really, really well. The minutes don't actually reflect. I have a strong recollection of him, really laying down, what the circumstances were, and I remember him, talking about people who were co-infected and, the terrible, horrible death rate from hepatitis C. And I think we did make as good a case as we could. Now, having said that, loads and loads of organisations in the disability world and the voluntary world, the Legal Action Group, the Law Centres Federation, as I recall, the Child Poverty Action Group, Disability Alliance as was, Citizens Advice nationally. I mean, all to a person, all to an organisation, we're making the case around, look, you've got to be more sensitive to the needs of our group of people, be it people with schizophrenia or people with this disease or that condition, and we were sort of picking holes in the draft guidance that we saw. Everybody, we were all doing it, lots of us were doing it, and we were making very little progress. They just weren't listening. It was ploughing ahead with the introduction of ESA. As I say, it was a very, looking back, a pretty depressing period.
And then we can see the next paragraph down, Martin Harvey making the case for Macfarlane Trust, and then the paragraph after that, Martin Harvey offering further information from Dr. Mark Winter to make presentation to those responsible for assessing ESA claims so that they could show the special difficulties that the Macfarlane Trust beneficiaries face. And that invitation was declined on the basis that the purpose of ESA is to individually assess somebody's functionality and capability to work. So there we've got the Department of Work and Pensions saying, no, thanks very much, we don't need your help. And then over the page...
I have to say that's right, and tragically, if I had £1 for every time I've seen that response, it would be good.
And then over the page, we have on the last paragraph before the bullet points, Martin concluded by stating that although he understood Macfarlane beneficiaries could not receive a blanket exemption from assessment, as with the DLA, so that was something that had been flagged up and had been rejected, was it? He hoped that their plight and unique combination of medical conditions would be flagged up to medical assessors and taken into account when they make their assessments. Neil requested that something be put on the DWP intranet about the history of Macfarlane Trust for staff reference purposes, and Moira and James agreed that it could. And then you can see from the action points that a history of the Macfarlane Trust was going to be provided with a hyperlink to the benefits waiver letter, and that would be placed on the DWP intranet, where medical assessors would have access to it. And the Macfarlane Trust would be provided with a copy of the ESA handbook, and you would provide information on ESA to be put on the Macfarlane Trust website, and then brief notes from Nick Fish. And so that was the end of that particular interaction with the DWP at that stage, was it?
No, because it continued. Sorry, can I just clarify the blanket exemption from assessment as with DLA? Some people thought there actually wasn't. There was some guidance, which, to be honest, I've never seen. But certainly as a matter of law, there was no passporting. Can I just add at this point, one of the reasons we're very concerned about employment support allowance was that under the old system for incapacity benefit, or the assessment they did for income support for people who didn't qualify for incapacity benefit, there was a whole series of passporting arrangements, a fairly lengthy list actually, and it included people who had an AIDS-related illness. It included people with severe mental impairment. It included people with severe mental illness. It included people with polyarthritis. There's a whole range of groups. People on the highest rate DLA care component at the time. So lots of Macfarlane registrants at the time, and indeed Caxton ones who came on board later, would have simply just been passported through the assessment for incapacity benefit. But government was very, very clear. They thought that was being abused, that sort of passporting process, they thought if everybody was assessed using this new assessment that was in some way work focused, it would help people move into employment, and it would enable the numbers to be reduced by 30%. Reality, what happened, very few of them moved into work. Large numbers have just had their benefits stopped. And of course, it wasn't helped by the fact that in 2008, you had the financial crisis and the labour market became a far more insecure place.
So you have raised in various documents that you provided to the inquiry some of the problems with the assessments, the poor quality of the assessments carried out by the DWP and private companies that they contract with for the registrants of the now the new schemes. Can you just outline to us some of the problems that you have come across?
Where do you want to begin? The people with haemophilia, particularly severe haemophilia and hemarthropathy, the aggressive and painful form of osteoarthritis caused by bleeds into joints, typically into ankles and or knees. A fairly consistent failure to assess whether they can walk 50 metres without significant discomfort. That's one of the criteria to get through the assessment. As I said in my memo to the House of Commons Select Committee, drawing upon my experiences with the community, failure to take account of the psychological impact of effective blood and the stigma attached to it. The fact that a lot of people have repeatedly told me how, they don't like telling their friends. Just this week, I dealt with someone who still hasn't told their parents. Just endless cases of very bad decision making. I mean, one chap I remember, very severe and actually somewhat unstable HIV. In the early days of ESA, he was assessed. He was found fit for work. Apart from the fact his elbow actually didn't have much flexion initially because of the hemarthropathy. One of the points that we'd made was that in a workplace he couldn't actually do his factor VIII injections because, as you know, it's quite an involved process involving an intravenous injection. The response from the DWP and from their medical assessor was, oh, well, if he has a bleed when he's at work, he can just, go aside and quickly inject himself. They thought that it was almost as if they thought it was a sort of intradermal insulin injection. What other ones? People have been told to use wheelchairs because that's part of the criteria for assessing whether someone can walk 50 metres without severe discomfort, and we'd have to point out, no, they can't use a wheelchair because their elbows are damaged, or it will trigger a bleed into their elbows. Horrible cases. Sorry, it goes on and on. I mean, I can talk about this all day.
What about, have you had experience of assessments being carried out by people who don't even have basic understanding of haemophilia?
Oh, yeah.
And assessors who have little knowledge.
I think that goes down as a definite yes. On the transcript.
And
Definitely.
Experience of assessors with little knowledge of the impact of HIV, and in particular the impact of having lived with HIV for many years before modern treatment.
No, absolutely. I think the problem with HIV from a benefits perspective is because treatments have moved on so much that people who are not familiar with it can think, oh, it's easy, they're just on their medication, they'll be fine.
And what about knowledge and understanding of the experience of widows, but other family members who have cared for many years for partners seriously ill with HIV and then had to suffer bereavement? Has there been an understanding of their experience and the impact that has on their ability to work?
In my experience, I mean, I'm sure the DWP would dispute what I'm saying. You'd have to ask them. And it is a fact that us advisors, we get a slightly skewed view because we see the problems, But as regards, widows, former partners, survivors, often the impact is psychological and often very, very significant psychological impact. The assessments that are done of people's mental health difficulties for ESA, in my view, are facile, almost laughable. They wouldn't even get past. I've said this in tribunal submissions that it wouldn't even come up to scratch for GCSE psychology. It's based on simple observations of whether someone has good eye contact. Are they trembling? Well, very few people do tremble unless they're highly anxious or they're on some sort of major antipsychotic medication, or they've got a neurological disorder, for example. What's their eye contact like? So we get these sort of, really woefully inaccurate. And groups like Mind, Sane, and many others have repeatedly expressed concerns to the DWP in consultative groups, in meetings with ministers, ad nauseam, about the inadequacy of the mental health assessment. There's apparently been some improvements after a while. Atos, the company that do the assessments, who have the contract to do them, they introduced what they call mental health champions. But I have to say, from my experience, I couldn't see any evidence of that having an impact. A large part of the problem is that the health professionals that they decided to use, I think when I was at DWP, I was told that was to save money, but I may be wrong. But the health professionals, there are very few doctors. The evidence given to the House of Commons Select Committee inquiry on ESA and PIP assessments, I think it revealed there were 3 doctors employed by the 2 assessment companies. A lot of them are general nurses, and all due respect to general nurses, they're not skilled at identifying mental health issues. Paramedics, who are great at assessing crisis situations, but may not have the knowledge to do functional assessments. I've just raised this, as I say, ad nauseam all the time in appeals. And one of the things I do is I look up what the registration status is of the health professional, and it's often quite revealing.
You've spoken in your...
Sorry, I'm giving very long answers, and I'm sorry about that, but this is a subject I feel passionately about, and it's a real cause of injustice to this community who've already suffered enough.
You've spoken in your evidence today and in your written evidence and the documents you provided to the inquiry about the real concern that you have about the repeated assessments that this community have been subjected to as a result of ESA and PIP. Can you tell us what the impact is that you see on this community of being subject to repeated assessments by someone often who doesn't understand the issues that they face, and as a result of which their benefits may be stopped?
Well, it's, as I said in my witness statement, I think I used the words, not necessarily in this order, sort of disbelief, anger and anguish, not to mention the financial. Just a few weeks ago I had a call from a chap, unfortunately he'd done his own PIP self-assessment form, and they took away his enhanced rate mobility component, even though he'd had that for years. Somehow it improved, and as he said to me, the consequence of that, means that I cannot take my daughter to school, no, it's just terrible. And to be repeatedly assessed. And what I am seeing, and I have raised it within the DWP, even just this week yet again, is people who've been awarded the enhanced rates of both components of PIP. As you probably know, PIP has two components, paid at one of two rates. And, they're awarded it, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, when really what should happen is that they should be put on, awarded it on an ongoing basis, where they then have the DWP carries out what's known as a light touch review after 10 years. In the case of ESA, I had situations where people were getting very short periods of assessment. I challenged that. The problem with challenging the period of assessment for ESA is not actually an appealable decision. It doesn't actually form part of the decision. It's an administrative decision as to when someone should be reassessed, based very often on the recommendation of the contractor who's carried out the assessment. And I think it's still the case now. I may be wrong, so I'll be happy to be corrected. The DWP's computer was incapable of awarding ESA for more than 3 years. So people will be awarded ESA even though their condition's not going to improve. If anything, it's going to deteriorate. These are long-term deteriorating conditions. So, and I mounted a couple of challenges to that over the years. One case sort of threatening judicial review. The situation slightly improved with the announcement, I can't remember the date, it's in my witness statement, where they introduced this thing called the Severe Conditions Guidance, which was a way of getting people off any further assessments. It was announced by Damien Green when he was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions at the Conservative Party conference. And they introduced that, but the criteria are really quite strict. And I'm not sure how thoroughly it's being implemented anyway. And I did give some figures of very, very low numbers. And I mean, often people don't know whether they've been covered by that guidance. And as I say, it's not even appealable decision. So you end up having to make a complaint. The DWP say it's not a service failure, so we're not going to deal with your complaint. I escalated to stage 2 or to the independent case examiner. And they either do or don't uphold that point. Rather perversely, I found actually submitting a mandatory reconsideration seems to get that changed. But it's hard graft. Shouldn't be having to do this to get people to avoid people being reassessed. But it seems to be an ongoing problem. As I say, the impact on people is pretty massive, really massive, and at the end of the day, it's a waste of the DWP's time, and it's a waste of public money paying the assessors to reassess people.
You have told us in your witness statement that you were instrumental in getting the DWP to carry out a review of cases of people with haemophilia who were refused.
Did I use the word instrumental?
I think you did, yes.
Did I? I don't think so.
I'll check that.
There was a word.
But you were involved in. Can I put it that way then? While I just check that, getting the DWP to carry out a review of cases of people with haemophilia who were refused PIP. Is this right that a systemic problem with how the functional needs of people with haemophilia were assessed by PIP was discovered, and they decided to review 410 cases, and 62% of those cases that they reviewed were awarded PIP or a higher rate of PIP. and so the average case received an average of more than £5,000 of back payments. Is that what happened as a result of that review?
There was a working party was set up with various campaign groups, and I heard about it. I'm trying to think who. It was someone in one of the campaign groups told me. I said, could I join that, please? I said, actually, I've got a lot of experience of this. But I was told there was some objections from one or two individuals who didn't see me as independent, which was unfortunate. But I did feed in to that review to my contacts. I also submitted some written questions at one point.
I've just checked.
I also spoke to Dr. Claire Lerris at the DWP, who is the sort of senior medical advisor on PIP, and I gave her lots of examples, and I sort of pointed to the appeal success rate I was having. Of course, it does take a while for you to identify a pattern when a new benefit comes in.
And as a result of that review, is this correct, that new guidelines were provided to assessors
Yes.
carrying out these assessments? Have you noticed a difference? Have things been better since the new guidelines?
To be fair, things are better. But again, maybe it's my skewed view of customers. I'm still coming across cases where there are bad decisions made. I was one that actually had to have a tribunal hearing about last year where it was clearly wrong. I sent it to I used the disputes procedure and the appeals procedure, and also raised it actually with Dr. Lerris, and she got someone to review it, and they came back and said they thought their assessment was correct. What then happened at the tribunal, it was a telephone hearing, as has been happening with the first tier tribunal since last March. I set the client up, briefed him on what to do, what to expect. I was in my office here. I had a phone call from the judge, tribunal judge. I said, Mr. Bateman, just want to tell you, we've looked at the papers, and we've decided your client's entitled to the enhanced rate of both components. There's no need for us to have a hearing. You kind of wonder why they refused him in the first place.
Are you able to assist at all with experiences of assessments in Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland?
Just the same. I don't know about Northern Ireland because PIP didn't come in until quite later because there were all the political problems around the Northern Ireland Assembly and so they didn't really have a functioning government. So the PIP came in much more recently. The tribunal procedure or the tribunal process in Northern Ireland also seems to be slightly different. But yeah, it's the same pattern in Scotland and in Wales. Sorry, can I just tell you about this case in Scotland? It's just occurred to me. It was a man from the infected blood community, and fragility of his haemophilia was such that he gave the example of standing on a dog biscuit at home, and that triggered a bleed into his ankle. And from the waiting room to the tribunal, which was about 15 yards, if that, he had to stop, I remember, because of the pain. There's another case, again in Scotland, where this chap had gone to his assessment, and he decided he would look smart, so he put on a suit, and in the assessment report, it said he was casually dressed. Okay, that may not be material, but it's indicative of the poor quality.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about, again, something you've mentioned several times in your evidence, the difficulty that many registrants face in terms of the cross-matching, data matching exercises undertaken by the DWP for those on benefits as part of their fraud investigations, and the fact that because payments from previously the Alliance House organisations and now the new schemes are disregarded for benefits, but will show up when those data matching exercises are undertaken, they are often or can often be interviewed under caution to investigate whether or not they're fraudulently claiming benefits. First of all, in your witness statement, you indicate that in discussion with Martin Harvey, he estimated that about 50 registrants that he knew of had been interviewed under caution. Are you able to give us any assistance as to how common this problem is in the registrant community?
It's well, I mean, since the pandemic, the DWP have had to redeploy staff to deal with the 3 million new universal credit claims that they've had. And they've also had, I think, about 10% of their staff either sick or self-isolating. So I wouldn't say they've stopped, and probably right for me to say, but they've really reined in on compliance and fraud investigation work. So I've not had very much. I think actually I've had 2 cases since last March. Before then, it was and certainly I'd noticed from when I started doing the work, it seemed to be a sort of fairly regular flow, trickle, not a flood, but a bit like a leaking roof. Sometimes it was like 1 a month, 2 a month, then you'd go a couple of months, several months without anything. So it's been quite an ongoing issue, and so I've described it as vexatious. I think the other thing about it, even though the numbers as a proportion of the community may not be massive, it's the fear that generates amongst people, and the anxiety that at any time they could be interviewed under caution. Most of the interviews actually are not fraud, not interviews under caution under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act carried out by a fraud investigator. They're actually compliance interviews. But compliance interviews can lead to a referral to the Fraud Investigation Service.
Are you aware of anyone that's been prosecuted from the community in relation to this?
Not that I've dealt with. I have people whose benefits have been stopped, and I've got them started again pretty quickly. I'd say their benefits have been suspended. But I'm not aware of anyone who's actually been prosecuted for benefit fraud in relation to non-declaration of McFarlane or Caxton fund monies. If there is anyone out there, then we need to deal with it, because that clearly would be a miscarriage of justice if they were convicted. The benefit fraud prosecutions I have dealt with amongst this community, I think there's about 3 or 4, have all been disability benefit related ones.
And your advice to registrants has been has been to declare to the DWP the payments that they receive from the schemes, and to keep those payments separately in a separate account from the benefits that they receive, even though prior to November 2017 there was no obligation to disclose that information. Is that correct?
I'm really sorry. Do you mind if I give another long answer?
No, it's your evidence.
But I hope it would help the inquiry. I mean, shall I just start by explaining how the data matching works? It's a major part of the DWP's anti-abuse, anti-fraud activity, because you do get people who have under-declared that they've got capital for means-tested benefits, and don't disclose that they've got a bank account with money in it. And there's a process of them carrying out a data match with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, who the banks and building societies report interest payments to for tax purposes, income tax purposes. The DWP then cross-match that information against the records of people receiving means-tested benefits. It then flags up possible undeclared capital, and they then have powers under the Social Security Administration Act 1992 to make the bank, building society, produce details of the account where the money is in and the copies of the bank statements. And that's fairly routine stuff that they do. In the past, registrants were told there was an administrative easement that the DWP brought in well before I was ever involved. It goes back in the sands of time. They were told they didn't have to declare that money to the DWP. In case of housing benefit and council tax benefit was actually written into the regulations. And so people didn't, tell. It was, I think, the reason being the fear of leaking out information about their HIV status. So that means that people often kept their Skipton money or McFarlane money or the initial payment, which I think they had, in a separate account, and so it gets picked up. Unfortunately, some people have mixed up, quite understandably, it's quite a reasonable thing to do, have combined their, we'll say, charity money with other money that they've got, and that can get picked up on a data match. And I'd certainly have dealt with a few cases, one in particular, a very harrowing case of a woman who was infected, where she'd had some money, I can't remember where from, but it was a significant amount of money, but not a huge amount, and it had been aggregated with her McFarlane, etc. money, and the DWP discovered this, suspended her benefit, but neither I nor her could easily work out how much of it was money to be ignored and how much of it was capital that should be taken into account properly. And it took 3 months to unravel all of that. And actually, in a large part, in consequence of that case, which was quite early on, I started to advise people, and McFarlane and Caxton both repeated this advice in writing and verbally: keep your charity money separate, so that if it does get identified by the DWP, it's easy to sort out. So that was my advice. And I then further developed that to say, and certainly I did it on an individual basis, and I also remember putting out some written advice around the community, that you do have the choice to tell DWP about your charity money. You don't have to tell them, but it might just prevent you getting asked to attend one of these interviews. And I know some folk have done that. It's entirely voluntary, and if people don't want to do it, that's their choice, and I wouldn't push them to do it. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Yes.
I mean, I can say a lot more about this, about the history of trying to sort this whole problem out.
That was the position, was it not, before November 2017? Is the position different now that DWP has amended its legislation and there's actually now a requirement to disclose or to declare to the DWP the payments from the new schemes?
the amendment came in, neither the charity, because I remember ringing Jan Barlow, I said, do you know that this legislation's come in about having to declare the England infected, the new schemes money? And she said, no, I wasn't aware. I just found it out through my normal updating processes that I subscribe to. I was really quite taken aback. But it is a mess because people have to declare their new scheme monies, but they still don't have to declare the old monies. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing, actually. And even when they do declare it, it's going to be disregarded anyway. And if they fail to disregard it, if they fail to disclose it, as most of them actually have, because they don't know they have to, if they fail to disclose it, there's no criminal offence of knowingly or dishonestly reporting a change of circumstances that affects your benefit entitlement.
And you've been working with, or you've been pressing the DWP, is this right, to provide a letter or some kind of information from the DWP to explain to people what their obligations are in relation to disclosing payments from the new schemes?
Yeah, there was the last. Excuse me. I think there's a draft of a leaflet which with my tracked comments on it. I have not seen anything further from them. I think it's that 2019. I recall a phone call from the senior policy official in it was Maybank just before Maybank holiday, because I was visiting my father, and had a long conversation with her about the way forward, and I suggested, maybe issuing a leaflet in batches, doing work with the community to prepare them. Don't just, send this out. And I've heard, I don't know what the current state of play is. I do have named contacts at the DWP to deal with these problems. And to be fair, they've all been really, really good and really responsive. And when I have phoned them about an individual case, they've got it sorted almost always within the hour. The longest I've had to wait, I think, was quite recently, actually. I think I waited 2 days to get it sorted. And I keep asking, what's happened to the leaflet? And I've been told various things. It's with ministers. It's with our comms team. There's Brexit, and ministers won't make a decision on it. I'm sorry, I just don't know what's going on. I've tried, and it's been done at a pretty senior level. Yeah.
Have you come across any clients who are deterred from claiming EBS payments because they don't want to disclose either their own HIV status or their connection to somebody that's had HIV, and by disclosing the EBS payment, that would lead to that disclosure? You haven't?
No, I haven't come across that.
And just lastly on this point, are you able to? Is there anything that you can add, or is there any difference to what the evidence you've given about interviews about data matching, interviews under caution, and so on? Does that evidence apply equally to the situation in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland?
I don't know about what. I don't think I've ever dealt with a case in. Well, I know I haven't dealt with a case in Northern Ireland. Trying to think if I've dealt. I may have. Oh yes, I have. I've dealt with. I think one case in Scotland, where obviously I'm just really not up to speed on even the outline of Scots law in this area. But I suspect it's. I mean, I know the data matching is a widespread issue. I mean, what's happened is I did get a name contact, John Armstrong, and more recently Bobby Taz. They have both been absolutely fantastic. That when somebody does get asked to attend a compliance or fraud interview, it's immediately stopped. Also, John did deal with a couple of cases where there was appalling conduct by DWP staff. There was one where the compliance officer said it was the effect, I don't know why you're claiming income support, you get all this money from the McFarlane Trust. And I think I spoke to the compliance officer as well and told her, perhaps if you had AIDS, you might not take that view. I was really quite angry with her. And then there was this awful incident where a woman was asked to attend, because she was a widow. She was asked to attend a compliance interview. Housebound because of her disability. She has a carer provided through the local authority. Very difficult for her to get out. Takes a lot of planning, a lot of work, a lot of effort. And she phoned the compliance officer, because they always give the name and phone number on their letters. And she left a message saying, it's really difficult for me to get out. I have to get my care. I'm housebound. Please, could you do a home visit? Now, she's very slow to answer the phone because of her mobility problems. And the compliance officer rang her back, I think, a day or two later. And a message was left on her answering machine saying, this is such and such from the compliance officer. Please, could you phone me back? Unfortunately, the compliance officer didn't put the receiver on the cradle properly, on the phone properly, so it was left recording. At which point the compliance officer started making mocking noises, similar to how Donald Trump did about a disabled journalist, and saying, "Oh, I can't, I'm always out. I can't get to the phone," or something like that. And it was disgustingly offensive. And then her colleague who was with her started laughing at that. I think it's the most humiliating experience a client of mine has ever had with the DWP. To be fair, the vast majority of DWP staff are perfectly decent people. I immediately reported it, and actually manager went out to see her within, I think, 24 hours. Deeply apologetic, very, very apologetic. I actually wanted the client to sue the DWP for an act of disability discrimination. She was up for doing that, and I spoke to a firm of solicitors who had a contract at the time for that area of law, and I spoke to a barrister I know who deals with it. Unfortunately, she backed out of pursuing it. So, sorry, I'm sorry, sorry, I can't talk all day about this stuff because, it's terrible what folk have gone through. Really awful. And that's probably the worst example, but it was so... I can't describe what it did to that woman, the humiliation of it.
The last topic I want to ask you about is the suggestions for the way forward. You set out in your witness statement clearly the attempts you've made to try and improve matters, particularly in relation to the risk of being interviewed under caution and the repeated assessments and so on. And you set out some ideas that you have for how matters could be improved for this community. Could you just explain to us where you have arrived at as the best solution for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased actually the inquiry asked this question because no one's ever asked me before. And I think tackling the need for people to claim means-tested benefits is a priority, but the solution actually does not lie in just increasing, call it what you like, support payments or compensation payments, because if those are disregarded, ignored as capital and or income for means-tested benefits, people are still caught in the means-tested benefit trap. What means-tested benefits do is that they inhibit people's ability to do things like just go get a job. I mean, I dealt with a case 3 weeks ago where a guy has, sadly, his ordinary capital has drifted just slightly above the £6,000 lower limit. He has to tell the DWP. That'll all be reassessed, paperwork back and forth. It inhibits people getting a relationship. There's lots of research evidence that's done by groups like Child Poverty Action Group about the way particularly women either get forced into a premature relationship because of the means-tested benefit rules, or they don't develop the relationship that, in the way one would expect it to develop in its normal course of events. And so I think if we can get people off means-tested benefits, that is really the way forward. So the solution I have suggested is to make the support payments or compensation payments, call them what you like, analogous to an occupational pension. If it could be administered by perhaps an NHS body. I realised the NHS Business Services Authority administered the NHS pension scheme. And the corollary would be that those payments then count as income against means-tested benefits. But if you increase the payments, and a cost of that can partly be offrayed by a transfer of the means-tested benefits paid to people, you can then devise a system that lifts people above means-tested benefit level, so they leave the means-tested nonsense and intrusion behind. It also means if it's through one of the NHS pension schemes, for example, if someone as happened again quite recently, someone they need to rent a new property, they've got to explain to the letting agent what's EVES, income in effective blood support scheme. It's not a conversation you want to have with your landlord or a letting agent, or if they apply for credit, want to get a mortgage or whatever it is. So the proposal I put forward in my witness statement, I mean, I commend it to you. It needs further work, but there's a lot of expertise. There are economists and many others within the DWP and the Department for Health and Social Care to try to devise a scheme that is non-means tested, that lifts people above means-tested benefit level. As regards repeated assessments for ESA and PIP, I don't think there's an easy answer, given the direction of government policy and their firm stance on doing that, and their distrust of benefit claimants, and almost the hostile environment that's been created towards benefit claimants over the years. But certainly more rigorous application of the 10-year rule for PIP, and also the severe conditions guidance for ESA, would be of tremendous assistance to this group, and indeed actually for lots of other people.
So those were
another long answer.
So those were the questions that I had for Mr. Bateman. Call participants and their recognised legal representatives may well have some more questions that they wish to put to him.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break till not before 5:30. That quarter of an hour will give Ms. Scott a chance to see what questions there are. There may be quite a number. There may be very few. I just can't tell you. But at not before 5:30 we'll come back. It may be a little bit longer if there are more questions than I might anticipate. But if you'd be kind enough to give us your time beyond that, I should be very grateful.
Yes, thank you.
5:30.